collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
All bus journeys in Cyprus today are free. It's all the idea of our Transport Minister, Marios Dimitriadis.
Now, the second thing we need to do, we need to educate our people so that they get the public transport into their blood. Because basically, when I grew up, for example, nobody was using the buses. This is a reality.
And we'll talk to an expert who's been in Cyprus briefing the government and all the movers and shakers in the hydrocarbons issue on a couple of policy papers that have been released by the German Marshall Fund of the United States.
It's an enormously complex issue, and while I think the country has political leaders who have grasped the significance of these discoveries, it's a major challenge for anyone to get their minds around all the technical details. So one of the problems with this is the temptation on occasions to boost an option that may in fact not be technically or commercially viable.
Wherever you travel in Cyprus today, take a bus. They're free. Yep, you heard me, absolutely free, and it's all part of our Transport Minister Marios Dimitriadis' idea to get people out of cars and onto the buses. Marios, I believe you even came to work this morning on the bus.
I did, and I was quite happy with it. I do believe in the concept of public transport. I think we need to promote public transport in Cyprus. It's something that we've fallen behind. And, it needs to become part of our culture as well.
You'll get some people out of their cars to try a bus, but it's a great idea and a bit of a publicity stunt for one day. How are you going to try and persuade people that this is something they should do on a daily basis? I mean, you're not going to take the bus to work on Monday.
This is true. And I think the effort to get people out of their cars in the buses, it would be a gradual process. It will take time. But in order to achieve that, we need to do first two things. The first thing is to improve the service, the level of service we have. We have to accept that the level of service we have today in Cyprus is not the level of service we would like to have. As a ministry, we have taken a number of initiatives during the last months. Like the introduction of the GPS that will give information to people where the bus is and what time is coming, and the introduction of smart ticketing. All these approaches that will be implemented over the next months. So we have already proceeded with the procedures, public procurement, to get the necessary equipment for this. And we have also done things like improving the network of buses and the frequency of buses as well, and things like improving the infrastructure for the buses. Now, the second thing we need to do, we need to educate our people so that they get the public transport into their blood. Because basically, when I grew up, for example, nobody was using the buses. This is a reality. Nowadays, I have to say that the frequent users of our buses are either the young generation, students and people who go to school, the retired people, and, we need to be honest about it, foreign workers. So what we have failed to capture are the people who go to work every day.
In a car on their own?
In a car on their own. So what we need to do, we need to start educating our children so that when they grow up and they get in our position, they are more accustomed to the idea of using public transport in Cyprus.
The infrastructure you mentioned is a little bit of a problem in terms of if you live somewhere in a village a little bit out of Nicosia, for example, or out of Limassol, and you want to commute on the bus to go to work so that you're not using your car, finding a place to park it and all the rest of it. Are the routes that we have helping you to do that? Or have you got to go to a central bus station, switch to a different bus to get to your place of work? Because if it's not easy, people won't do it.
Well, there's a whole thinking behind the design of the routes. It is a reality that our routes, they need improvement. What we have done recently, we have finished a review of all the routes we have in Cyprus, and we have actually started to implement gradually the new route system. Okay? This new system will be introduced gradually, and we do hope that it will improve a lot the kind of service we offer to commuters.
And then, assuming that this works, obviously the buses need to run on time is the other thing, and we've spoken about this before. The cost of infrastructure in terms, for example, of bus lanes, particularly on the busy roads in towns, is surely a high priority.
Well, regarding any new roads that we construct within the city, all of them obviously they have bus lanes because they need to, we have these new standards about sustainable mobility, so they need to abide to those standards. Now, for the roads we already have, obviously it's more problematic because we don't have the space to construct separate bus lanes. Having said that, we are doing what we can to improve the situation there as well, because the buses, they do have priority in the roads. And this is a common problem in many European countries. So we're trying to find ways around that.
And of course there's also bike lanes sprouting up all over the place, so that's another part, I suppose, although it's not public transport, it is a way of trying to cut the number of people, frankly, polluting our cities with their cars.
And, you know, even bikes, they should be part of the public transport system. And this is the mentality they have in cities like Amsterdam, for example, where 40% of the people, they commute with their bikes. Bikes, they should be part of the public transport system. In Cyprus, we use more or less cycling like a leisure thing, whereas in other cities, they use them for commuting. So what we have at the moment, we have a complete design about the bike lanes, and anything we do needs to, to be according to that design, because the eventual aim is to incorporate the cycling in the public transport system and not have it as a completely separate thing that is done for leisure purposes or for exercise.
And of course, if people could get their bikes on the bus, they could come into town from outside and then cycle the end distance. I mean, do you see that sort of thing happening?
Well, let's start with getting them in the buses and then we see what happens with the bikes.
How are you going to measure? I presume it's of interest to you to measure how many citizens of Cyprus take you up on this free bus trip today.
Hey, we're going to get some statistics from the companies, and then we're going to compare it with the usual traffic, and we're going to have an idea of whether this initiative worked or not.
And are you going to get any feedback from the people who try out the bus? Because it would probably be quite useful to see whether or not they thought it was an experience they would like to repeat.
Well, this effort actually is done in cooperation with the companies that are running the bus routes, and they are doing a number of initiatives as well to promote the whole effort.
But the government must be paying for it.
The government is paying for it, of course, because basically we will not get any revenue for it. But they are doing some effort as well to promote the whole service. And as part of this, we'll get some feedback about the whole experience and whether it worked or not. And any information, we'll give it to you as well.
That is our Minister for Communications and Transport, Marios Dimitriadis, talking about the free buses. Yes, all day today, Friday, just to celebrate the fact that we do now have a pretty decent public transport system. Get on a bus, take a trip. It's for free.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
In other news this week, July is of course the anniversary of the Turkish invasion of Cyprus that followed the coup to overthrow Archbishop Makarios. As the Greek Cypriots mourned and the Turkish Cypriots celebrated, both leaders spoke of looking to the future. They both toned down the customary rhetoric and spoke of lessons that they hoped had been learned. President Anastasiades said the Greek Cypriot leadership was now mature and courageous enough to recognise the criminal mistakes committed in the past. Over in the north, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan flew in for the celebrations, and Turkish Cypriot leader Mustafa Akinci said, "I hope that enough lessons have been derived in the past 41 years and that it is now clear that our current situation does not date back to July the 20th, 1974. There is also a July the 15th, 1974 that needs to be remembered." He was, of course, referring to the Greek-backed coup to overthrow President Makarios. And the Turkish Cypriot Mufti, Dr. Talip Atalay, also spoke of peace being on its way to Cyprus when he was taking part in a pilgrimage to the Hala Sultan Teke by some 1,000 Turkish Cypriots who bussed over to mark the end of Ramadan. Thousands of British expats and other Barclays Bank account holders are going to see their accounts closed by September unless they have a minimum deposit of €100,000. It's left a lot of expats scrabbling to get back to the UK to try and sort out the mess, especially those whose pensions are paid into a Barclays account, but which doesn't contain the necessary £100,000.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Well, you may have thought that the issue of energy in Cyprus and our finds of hydrocarbons under the sea was all but done and dusted. Well, certainly it isn't, and somebody's been in Cyprus this week, meeting with the government, the movers and shakers, and indeed the energy companies themselves. He is Sir Michael Leigh, a consultant and senior advisor to the GMF, that is the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Michael, tell us first what the idea of this visit was, because you brought with you some research, I think, that you were going to tell the people here about.
My organisation has been working for 4 years on the implications of the gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I came here to share with policymakers, industry people, academics, some of the results of our recent research.
And what were the results of that research? Because if you look generally at Cyprus as just a very small part in a much bigger picture, both politically and, of course, in energy terms, you really do have to look at the whole area, don't you?
As to Cyprus itself, the gas discoveries will be sufficient to ensure a regular, relatively clean source of supply of energy to the island for the indefinite future. The paradox of the situation is that to bring this gas on shore, it's also necessary to have a clear plan for exporting some of it, as Cyprus itself will only ever consume some 10% of the total. So much of our research and much of my discussions this week has been focused on different options for exporting the gas.
And those options are where? Egypt, I know, is a favourite, and there's also been talk in the past of sharing a stream with Israel.
Egypt is the main focus of attention of the companies and the governments for the time being. The possibility of exports to Turkey after a settlement have not been excluded and might have certain advantages. There's also a scheme which in my view is a bit of a red herring, but that is quite popular in some circles, the idea of building a new pipeline from Cyprus to Crete and then to the Peloponnesus and into Europe. This is a project which is now being the subject of a detailed feasibility study by the EU to see whether or not it makes sense commercially. So these are among the principal options that are on the table at the moment.
But all those things that you've mentioned, and building pipelines and so on, are fraught with danger, not only in the sense that they're very difficult to achieve technologically, but then you've also again got to look at the politics in the region, the role of Russia and the way they're sending their gas to where, and energy security in Europe, and I know you've dealt with that because you've spent time at the European Commission.
All these options are enormously expensive, and for any of them to become a reality, investors have to be found who are ready to put their own money on the table. For that, they need to be confident that the price they will get in the end will give them a good return for their investment. So independently of all political considerations, of risks related to nationalization, such as happens sometimes in developing countries and so on, it's really the bottom line that will determine the bankability of any of these projects. And at the moment, energy prices are very low. So many of the people I've been talking to think that there's likely to be quite a pause now before there are any dramatic further developments until energy prices begin to rise significantly.
And are they likely to? Because when you've got fracking as the new popular way of extracting gas all over the place, it seems that prices are set to continue to fall.
I think the consensus in the industry is that prices are now very low. They've risen a little. As with the stock market, you never know when they've bottomed out or not. But given population growth, increasing demand, I think the expectation is that after a pause whose length cannot be determined now, prices will rise again. And when there's a prospect of a better return, then probably more investors will come onto the scene.
And going back to the quantities, Cyprus really is a very small player in this, and Lebanon hasn't even, I think, started really, and a lot of people think that Lebanon could be a fairly large player in the region if and when they get round to exploiting any hydrocarbons they have. So if we're talking about going, in a sense, in with someone as an island, we really don't have too many options, do we?
There are several options, and I think the main strategic approach is to identify a project that is viable in its own right, but could be further extended in the future to a partner, whether Israel or Lebanon, for example. The main challenge now is to find a way to bring the gas onshore, to develop the field, and then to bring the gas onshore, and then to work out from there what is the best export strategy. And I think what the authorities here and the companies would like to do is to find a project along these lines that works and that could then be extended so that new providers of energy could come in at a later stage, such as Israel, or indeed one day perhaps Lebanon. And for example, the idea that after a settlement Turkey might be a lucrative market for Cyprus, the idea there would be to build a pipeline from the offshore fields to Cyprus that can provide for domestic demand but is large enough so that if others come in, it could also be used as a conduit for further exports. All this is enormously complex and expensive, but the bottom line is that these discoveries mean that Cyprus itself should have for a century or so a relatively inexpensive and relatively clean source of energy that could become the main basis for generating electricity on the island. Electricity rates in Cyprus are among the most expensive in Europe. This would definitely bring down costs. It's also important to do so in a way that protects the environment. And an important development in this regard is a recent EU directive that Cyprus as a member is obliged to implement to ensure the safety of offshore installations, to avoid the risk of an accident, or if there is an accident, to ensure rapid intervention to limit the effects. So you have a complex set of issues which are political, diplomatic, economic, security-related, environmental, all of which have to feed into determining the right strategy.
But we have been looking at all of these different things for the last 4 or 5 years, and you've visited before, I think. How much further down the road would you say we are, even given that there seems to be now a thought that perhaps it is time to take stock?
What strikes me compared with previous visits is a new sense of realism. Some of the more ambitious schemes, extremely expensive schemes, like building a liquefied natural gas plant at Basilikos in the south of the island, have been all but eliminated now. Other options that people used to talk about, such as compressed natural gas as an alternative, have also been more or less set aside. So I do see a kind of whittling down of the options from a universe of possibilities to a smaller number that could actually prove commercially viable.
Now, Norway has given us a lot of advice, and they're one of the leaders in how to manage any revenues that come, because a lot of people say the discovery of oil, gas or hydrocarbons can actually put a country into more trouble than being a salvation. What's your thought on the way here in Cyprus the authorities are looking at how best to ensure that any revenues that come are there for future generations?
A very wise decision of the government has been to set up a sovereign wealth fund, which will indeed ensure that most of the revenues, the future revenues from gas when it comes on stream, will not be used just to defray daily expenses and to disappear into the budget of the state, but will be in a separate fund, separately managed, probably under the Ministry of Finance, exactly as you say, to ensure that this resource is preserved for future generations. This has been the Norwegian experience, and it has proved to be one of the best practices developed in the management of energy revenues so far. So it's a very positive fact that the government has decided to go down this path. To make it a reality, of course, first of all the gas has to be developed, and then the revenue has to come on stream. And present estimates are that this might take place around 2020, 2021, if everything goes well. But it's good to know that there's a sound plan in a way to protect such funds from being raided on a daily basis for whatever needs the government may have, and to ensure that it's put to good use for the benefit of all the people of Cyprus.
While you've been here, you've talked, I know, to the energy companies, as we mentioned earlier, to members of the government, to the president even. And they all presumably have, I wouldn't say conflicting, but possibly complementary and not always agreeing views on the way they look at the whole issue. How do you and other experts bring all those different ideas together to get a holistic picture, basically? Because I think that's what we're lacking here in Cyprus. We get tidbits in the press that say one thing and then a minister says something else, and a lot of people don't really know where we are at the moment.
It's an enormously complex issue, and while I think the country has political leaders who have grasped the significance of these discoveries, it's a major challenge for anyone to get their minds around all the technical details. So one of the problems with this is the temptation on occasions to boost an option that may in fact not be technically or commercially viable. And I think one of the roles of outside experts, such as myself, is as a kind of reality check. And we don't hesitate to share our views with political leaders, from the president through to the ministers and to senior civil servants, as to which of these options seem to us to be the most potentially viable, and to introduce a strong dose of realism into the debate.
And of course, if you're being at all realistic about Cyprus, the elephant in the room is the division of the island and the ongoing negotiations for a settlement. In your view, what impact would a Cyprus settlement and presumably the stability that everybody talks about in that event bring to the table when it comes to the use Cyprus can make of its energy?
The first thing that investors look at is the stability, the predictability of the investment climate. And where there are uncertainties about that, investors may be more discouraged. In Cyprus, we have a situation in which peace has prevailed for a long period, notwithstanding the division of the island and the existence of the Green Line. So we're not talking about a situation in Cyprus comparable to that in some countries in the Middle East. Nevertheless, to an investor, it does make a certain difference as to whether the domestic market we're looking at consists of only part of the island or all of the island. Also, once a settlement has been implemented, the EU will certainly come in with significant additional support for infrastructure and for other such measures, which can help to create a more attractive climate for investors. But very significantly too, in terms of our discussion about export options, it's clear that in the absence of a settlement, there is no question of planning to export future supplies of gas to Turkey. After a settlement, I think this option would be reviewed very carefully and perhaps more positively. At the end of the day, commercial viability, bankability, as they like to say in the profession, will determine which investments are made and which are not. But a settlement will provide a more stable environment for these decisions to be taken on the basis of business considerations.
And if we finish off with the sort of export options without a settlement, as you mentioned at the beginning, Egypt seems to be a favourite one, but Egypt actually owes money from past deals, doesn't it? It's not got a very good record as a customer.
Egypt is attractive as a neighbour and as a country which requires gas in order to provide for its own population's needs. It has a growing population with an increasing demand for gas, and it has declining supplies of its own. So it does look as a potentially attractive market not too far away. On the other hand, Egypt's reputation as a payer is not very good, and there are all kinds of arbitration cases underway concerning past projects. Plus, their own production may ramp up so that by the mid-2020s they might be able to provide for their own needs. There have been a number of very large recent investments from BP, for example, in the Western Nile Delta, and as that gas begins to come on stream, the need for imports will diminish. There's always the possibility of using the little used LNG plants, liquefied natural gas plants in Egypt to export to more distant markets, but for various reasons this is an uncertain prospect. So after my visit I come away with the idea that politically and in broad terms Egypt is an attractive option, but there are still many, many obstacles to be overcome before this could be a reality.
I'm sure you'll be back again in fairly short shrift, and we will wait with interest to see just which way things turn out for the gas and hydrocarbons in Cyprus. Sir Michael Leigh, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.